Romans chapter. We're in Romans, and in a chapter. Reverend Wallace, if you could pray for the Bible study. Amen. Amen. So, what is our outline called? Nope, that's the method. What's the outline called? 7 steps to the throne. Awesome. What step are we on? Oh, man, we are getting it. What chapter are we in?
4.
We're in chapter 4. We finished chapter 3 last time. Does anybody need a card? Anybody not have one? Want one? Here we go. Go ahead. Boom. There you go, sir. Boom. Here, pass it. Give him one. There you go. Boom. All right. Here we go. All right. So, here's your outline. One more over here. Oh, yeah. There you go. There you go. There you go. Yeah. All right. So, we are in Romans chapter 4. We are in salvation. We've covered, what did we already cover? What subject? Sin. Perfect. Thank you, sister. We have covered sin. Now we're moving into salvation. We started salvation last week, halfway through Romans chapter 3, beginning in verse 23. Somebody go ahead and just read it. Chapter 3, 23. Perfect. That was how we pretty much ended sin, and we moved into salvation. And verse 31 gives us that we're establishing the law. We're not doing away with the law. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to start here in Romans chapter 4. If somebody could just read verses 1 and 2. Perfect. So he asks a question. We'll try to simplify it. What did Abraham find in flesh? What did he find in flesh before God? That's the question that's being asked here. Did Abraham find anything in his flesh when being compared before God? And he gives the answer. If Abraham were justified by works, he would have whereof to glory, but not before God. He was saying, if Abraham was justified by works, he has no glory before God. If his actions were the thing that is going to measure who he is and what he is before God, he has nothing before God, which we know. This is obvious. If you read Romans 1 through 3, we learn that everybody's a piece of work. All of us, right? But that's what we need the grace of God for, is to overcome the sin, is to move ourselves into a new form of world. And he's going to talk about the method of salvation. Now, this is a in-depth theological thing. I say in-depth because it's the most highly debated thing in the Bible ever. It is the thing that separates true Christianity from all other forms of it. And it falls to here. It begins in verse 3. Somebody go ahead and read verse 3. Okay, this verse is quoted a lot over and over and over, and it is a quote. The verse that even here is quoting another verse, which is in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. Genesis 15:6 is this big moment when God shows up to Abraham and offers him all the promises, and Abraham believes God. And the Bible tells us that when he believed God, God counted that for righteousness. His life was not righteous, but his belief in God was counted unto him for righteousness. This is a pivotal verse. It's mentioned many times throughout the New Testament, and it is the most important verse in probably the whole Bible, truthfully. Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. And then it continues on. Somebody go ahead and read verse 4. Go ahead and read verse 5 as well. Perfect. So verse 4 says, and this, put the emphasis on those last three words, and understand this is the best way to describe it. When he says, in verse 4, he says, but of debt, okay? He's saying, if a person works in order to receive their righteousness, they don't receive it by grace. Why? Because grace, one of its fundamental words is in that word unmerited. Unmerited favor. So therefore, if they do work towards something, and they do work towards righteousness, they're working on debt. Why are they working on debt? Because by the time they decide to do good, they've done enough sin. So now they're working out of a hole. And you can just think about it financially, right? If a person gets a credit card and doesn't realize they have to pay the credit card back, and they're spending, by the time it's time for them to pay it back, they're in a hole. They're in probably a crushing hole, as most people have found, because the interest has already culminated and you're just paying off interest. That's all you're doing. You're not making a dent into your actual debt. And so is our sin, because our sin is a debt to us, and it's debt that we owe to God. If we owe every sin we've done to God, we cannot do enough good to overcome the bad. Why? And this is where it gets important. Because your good is not what counts as righteousness. So you could decide today, I'm never going to sin again, and you would still be in debt to the day you die, even if you stop right now. But there's an important portion, and it's right here. He says it in verse 5, he's walking this way, but to him that worketh not, okay, him that decides that work is not what's going to get me righteousness, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly. Who's that? We'll talk about in a little bit. It says, his faith is counted for righteousness. Somebody go ahead and read verses 6 through 8. Perfect. Now, remember, we talked about this very recently, about using really good, very, very good commentaries. What did we establish was the best commentary you can get? Webster's Dictionary. Thank you. All right, everybody was on the same page this time. A Webster's Dictionary, okay? If you want to get somewhere, you need to know what the words mean. And in this case, the word you need to know is impute, okay? The reason impute is unique is because it's almost only ever used in a negative connotation. And it makes sense because the word itself means to lay the responsibility for something on a person. Whether it's an action that they did, right? You could impute the economic recession of 2008 on George Bush's economic policy or something like that. It's never going to be a good thing. We're not going to say, we imputed the victory of World War II. It's not usually how we use the word. We could, though. We could use the word in that way. And often we should, and we will in this verse, or in this chapter. But he says, he first, which is kind of Paul commentating or explaining what he's about to say, how David explains how blessed it is unto the man whom God imputes righteousness without works. And he explains it in verse 7, right? Blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven. Their known sins, the things that they knew were wrong and did them anyway, their iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. That's a blessed man who's they're forgiven and covered and we're good to go. And he explains it in verse 8. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. Okay, what's he saying here? Blessed is the man who the Lord does not lay the responsibility for their sin on them. Why are they blessed? Well, because everybody has the sin, and it could be laid on them, right? The sin they do need to pay for the responsibility. Logically, the responsibility is laid on them, so they're blessed if it's not laid on them, right? In the same way that if you were to show up, okay, go back to the debt situation, right? If you were to show up and call your credit card company and they said, hey, don't worry, you don't need to pay it off. You'd be like, wow, awesome. Thank you very much, right? That would be a blessing, we would say. But in the same way. If God says you don't need to pay back your sin, that's a blessing. He's not imputing the responsibility for your actions on yourself. Okay, we're going to keep on going. And then in verse 9, somebody go ahead and read verse 9 and 10. Okay. Now, I will say sometimes Paul likes to use the word circumcision and uncircumcision a lot. And you're kind of like, all right, could we not say it so many times back to back? You start getting lost in, what are we talking about here? Who are we talking about here? I'm confused. Okay, well, let's just explain it. We're going to call uncircumcision outward holiness. That's what it is. That's all it is, okay? It's an outward show of holiness. Okay, so he's saying here, cometh the blessedness then on, and really here he's talking about the Jews or the non-Jews. Is it to the Jews only or also to the non-Jews? Well, the Jews had the outward show of holiness, which was circumcision. The non-Jews didn't. He says, in the end of verse 9, right? For we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness, not the circumcision was reckoned to him for righteousness. It was the faith. Okay? So not the outward show of holiness was reckoned to him for righteousness. Okay, stop using the word reckoned. It was not the outward show of holiness that gave him righteousness, but it was faith that gave him righteousness. And then he begins to explain it here. In verse 10, he says, so when did it happen, right? How was it reckoned? Or when did it happen? When he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? Before he had the show of outward holiness or after? Okay. And the answer is before. In Genesis chapter 15, the promise comes to Abraham again. And he says, this is your promise. And that's in Abraham. Verse 6 says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. So when he receives righteousness is believing the promise of God. In chapter 17, after everything goes down with Hagar and Sarah, and now he has Ishmael and Isaac, that's when God gives the order to do the circumcision. Okay? This is when Ishmael circumcised and Isaac at the same time, but that's when this order is given to do this outward show of holiness. It's after he already received the righteousness. The outward show of holiness is a result of the righteousness, but it's not a causation. And it does not buy him anything. Somebody go ahead and read verse 11 and 12. Okay, let's just you can buzz through all of this. The outward show of holiness is here we go, verse 11, a seal of the righteousness of the faith. The outward holiness that men and women demonstrate is a sign of the thing that happened inside. The seal of righteousness that comes through faith, and only through faith. And so then the outward show follows it. And then in verse 12, he says, the father of the circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only. Meaning there, he's talking about an ethnicity thing. It's not just to the people that receive this order, but it's to any that, what does it say there? Walk in the steps of that faith. That's the key word. Those that walk in the faith, that follow the faith, that also, ready, believe God, and it will be counted unto them for righteousness. Continues on, all right? And we'll go ahead and jump down to, actually we'll read verse 13 and 14. Somebody go ahead and read those two. Okay. He says that all of this is done, right? The promise that he should be the heir is not through the law. Why? Well, let's just simplify things. The law, which we call the law, right? Mosaic law came under who? Moses, right? Yeah. Under Moses, right? Well, Moses is not even born yet, so the Mosaic law can't be applied to him. That's actually not the law he's referring to here. He's referring to the law of circumcision, okay? And he's saying that the promise didn't come through that law to do this thing to your kids. It came through the faith, which he believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. I'm going to say that a lot, okay? He believed God, and he was righteous because of it, right? That's where this promise came, and if it was through the law, then the faith is irrelevant, okay? If you have to keep this weird law of circumcision in order to get the promise, then what's the point in believing in the promise? Let's just teach the law. We don't need to worry about believing whether or not it's true. Okay? This is what separates Christianity and God's faith from any other pagan religion that has existed throughout the world. If you were to go through history, faith is irrelevant. Faith is not a thing that matters in all of these subcultures. The instruction is given, do the thing. And you say, well, I don't believe it's real. Dude, shut up and do the thing, or else the God of the mountain's going to destroy us all. We don't care if you believe it or not. Do the thing. God says, I don't care if you do the thing. If you don't believe, doesn't matter. It's a completely different perspective. Why? Because it's one built on relationships. One built on love of God, not one built on just irrelevant details like whether or not you brush your teeth the right way. It's whether or not you believe in God and believe his word and believe who he is. That's what's important, nothing else. The rest of it is a result, but it is not the important factor on which your life will turn. And then he continues on in verse 15. Somebody go ahead and read it and we'll explain it very quickly. Perfect. The law works wrath. Why does the law work wrath? Wrath is an important word, okay? Wrath is not anger. Wrath is punishment as a result of transgression. That's why the wrath of God comes on to those that are the children of disobedience, okay? And when he says where the law is, there is transgression. Why does transgression show up where there's a law? Well, thank you. Perfect. There's no other explanation, right? Once there's rules, then you can break the rules, and then you can get punished for breaking the rules. If there's no rule, then it would be wrong for you to be punished. However, that does not mean that the thing in itself was not wrong to do, right? This is the tedious element of parents, is how to teach your kids something is wrong before they do the thing. Usually it's always a causation thing. They did the thing, now we got to tell them it's wrong, and then next time we can punish them for doing the wrong thing. But if they don't know something's wrong, then how do you punish them, right? It's a whole weird element there. Well, it's the same with God, but the truth is God's law is in the hearts of men and women, and that's what the first 3 chapters have been teaching us, is that the law of God is in the hearts of men and women, and when they break it, they are breaking the law that is in their nature. It is their nature to break the law, but it is in their heart what the right thing is to do. And so therefore it requires a lot of back and forth. But once the law is established, then the wrath can come, and then we move on, right? We move on to verse 16. 16 and 17. Somebody read those 2 verses. Thank you. Okay. We're going to have to simplify these verses because there's a lot of parenthetical things added into the middle of it that make it a little bit confusing if you're not tracking who it's talking about when, especially when he uses he's and hims. Okay? But let's end it. Go through the end of verse 16 where it says, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also, which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. Skip past this portion, right? He's the father of us all. Before him whom he believed, skip through some, calleth those things which be not as though they were. Okay? What's it saying? The people that are of the faith of Abraham, who, when he was standing before God, he called the things that were not as though they were, because God had promised it to them, promised it to him. That's the faith on which we stand, calling the things which are not tangible as though they are just as real as if they were tangible, because we have the word of God to stand on. And if God gave his word, we can follow on his word, because he is ever faithful, ever true, and he is the most honest of all of us. Right? If God says something, it is what it is. So we can call the things that are not tangible as though they were tangible, because he said it. That's what that whole verse is saying. And those are the people that receive the grace. And those are the people that receive the promise. What is the promise? Well, the promise is Jesus. Without getting too far into it, the promise is Jesus. That's the promise. Okay? And then it continues on. In verse 18. Somebody go ahead and read it. Okay. Who against hope believed in hope. Against the hope that he could tangibly make up in his mind, he still believed in the hope of God. And the hope that God had said something regardless of whether or not he could make it make sense. God gave me his word, and I can stand on that. That's what it's saying. Against hope, he believed in hope. That he might be the father, right? That he might do all of these things and have all of these children. And it continues on in verse 19 and 20. Actually, 19 through 21. Somebody go ahead and read it. Perfect. Now, in this case, it's talking directly about the birth of Isaac, the promised child, right? At this point, he's over 100. His wife is over 90. People know. Those people don't normally have kids anymore, okay? And he's saying here, he did not, I like how it says it, he considered not his own body. He did not even consider his own body. This is a kind of faith that breaks our brain. And this is where God calls us to go, is to not even consider the impossibilities. This is where it pushes. This is different than that promise he had, right? In Genesis 15, which is you're going to get this seed and all this stuff is going to happen, as years before the real breaking point that it's talking about here, that he would not even consider his body or Sarah's body as reasons why God might not fulfill the thing. And it tells us here in verse 20, he staggered not at the promise of God. When it's talking about staggering, right, the tripping or stumbling or really reconsidering things, he didn't even stumble at the promise of God, which would only come because he didn't believe fully, but he was strong in faith, giving glory to God. He was sure of the thing. If God said it, it is sure. And verse 21 nails the coffin. And being fully persuaded that what he, God, had promised, God was able also to perform. I'm sure of this. I don't stagger. I am 100% fully persuaded that if he made the promise, he will perform the promise. I don't need to be worried about it or have an unsure footing. I am sure of this thing. I'm fully persuaded. That's faith. And then it continues on in verse 22. Somebody go ahead and read verse 22. All right, we're back to this word imputed, okay? He was fully persuaded about God, and therefore it was accredited to him, or it was given quality to him that he was righteous. Okay? Now, we're going to use this word imputed here. It's going to be important. This chapter ends on it, okay? But remember, what is imputed? Laying the responsibility for something on somebody, okay? And it still matters even when we're talking about imputing something for righteousness, okay? He laid the responsibility of righteousness on Abraham. What does that mean? Responsibility is, we're not going to talk about whether or not you have responsibility, okay? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about getting credit as if you had responsibility, okay? What do I mean by that? The person responsible for doing something gets the credit for doing the thing, whether it's good or bad, right? If you are, in this case, let's go with one of the ones that always is easy to understand. If a military group goes to an area and does a war crime, the guy in charge is responsible for the war crime that was committed, okay? And he's going to bear the responsibility of it. The same way that if that same group went into that place and liberated 5,000 captives, he would get the responsibility and he would take the credit for the thing. Okay, well here, the same word when it says impute sin or impute righteousness is talking about how the reward will come. If you're imputed sin, you receive the reward of failing God. If you are imputed righteousness, then you receive the reward of fulfilling Jesus Christ's task on the cross. As if you were the one that died on the cross for everybody. That's how this changes, right? In the same way that if you were to be given imputed sin, you would have to suffer the punishment of Lucifer standing before God and denying him and trying to usurp his throne. In the same way, when you are imputed righteousness, you receive the reward as if you died on the cross for everybody. You are viewed in a completely different light than what you ever should have been viewed as. Because even no matter how good you are, you didn't die on the cross for everybody. Right? Continues on into verse 23. Somebody read verses 23 through 25. He's saying he believed God's promise and received righteousness because of it. And it wasn't written just for his sake, that if he believed God, he would receive righteousness. But for us also, to whom, and I like how he says, it shall be imputed if we believe on him. Anybody that will believe on Jesus, who God raised from the dead, the Jesus that died for our offenses and was raised to justify us, if we would believe on him, we should receive the righteousness the same way Abraham did. That is why this portion is called salvation. That is salvation. Believing God and therefore receiving righteousness as a result of it. It is what everything hinges upon, is whether or not you believe in Jesus. Then everything else will follow that, and it will double down on it. But it is the turning point in life, whether or not I believe that Jesus died for my sins and rose again to save me. That is the turning point of any life of any human being ever. That is the turning point. That is the end of Romans chapter 4. Romans chapter 5 will wrap up sin, or salvation. We'll wrap up salvation, and we'll go into the fun portions of Romans. We've just been laying the foundation. We haven't talked about anything interesting yet. We've just talked about basic stuff. However, that basic stuff needs to be hammered into our brain so we understand it completely and wholly and thoroughly. Because if we don't understand the foundations, how can we ever build the walls? How can we build a roof if we don't have a foundation? If we don't understand how to get saved, how are we ever supposed to build ourselves up in our most holy faith? We can't even start. So, God bless you. Go with God. God will go with you. Remember, we got church Thursday. We got our special Bible study on Saturday. Waco Tanks. We're going to have a grand old time. Be a part. Have a good time with all of us. God bless you. Reverend Hooker, if you could dismiss us in prayer.